on anti-Semitism when Dr. Jennifer Kusa discussed the origins and histories of anti-Semitism. Tonight, we'll hear from Ira Forman about modern anti-Semitism in the United States and around the world. And in 3 weeks, on October 27th, the Anti-Defamation League will lead training on traditional anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias. And the program is geared towards teens and adults. It's an interactive workshop which will provide real examples and tools for how to combat anti-Semitism that you may encounter. Mr. Forman received his BA from Harvard University, where he graduated magna cum laude in government. He received his MBA from Stanford University's Graduate School and is a visiting professor and senior fellow at Georgetown University's Center for Jewish Civilization, where he has taught courses on contemporary anti-Semitism. Since 2018, he has served as senior advisor on anti-Semitism at Human Rights First and is a senior fellow at the Moment Institute and produces Moment Magazine's Anti-Semitism Monitor project. He co-edited and wrote for the reference book Jews in American Politics, and from 2013 through 2016, he served as the State Department's Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism, and for nearly 15 years as the Executive Director of the National Jewish Democratic Council, and from 1977 to 81, he worked as a legislative liaison and political director for AIPAC. So Mr. Forman, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for that overly generous introduction. So tonight, I'd like to talk about 4 topics. First, what has happened over the last number of years? Bill said 5. I'm going to play with that number a little bit. What is anti-Semitism like today? What is its nature? What types of anti-Semitism are we dealing with? And where does it appear? The third topic is going to be what can be done. And finally, I usually get the question, why? Certainly from all my students, they always ask why. Why anti-Semitism? And I won't give you a spoiler alert. It's pretty simple. In any case, so let's start with what's been happening over recent years. I'd like to go back a little further than 5 years. I'd like to take you back to the day I stepped into the State Department to be the anti-Semitism monitor at the State Department. That was May of 2013. And at the time, we had rising anti-Semitism. We had, many of you remember, even a decade before, the Second Intifada and the Durban Conference, which shocked a lot of the people in the Jewish NGO world with the depth and levels of anti-Semitism in Durban, not just by governments, but by nonprofits that are supposed to be in the human rights business. We had the economic recession, the Great Recession of 2009, which everybody was expecting to bring all kinds of chaos in terms of racism or anti-Semitism, other forms of bigotry. We saw a little bit of it. But when I walked in the door in 2013, we had anti-Semitism in the Muslim world, both the Arab and non-Arab world, but we had very small Jewish communities there left. And we had anti-Semitism in Europe, but Jewish communities in places like the larger ones, France, Germany, the UK, were relatively stable. And anti-Semitism in the United States was at not an all-time low, but had gone on a decline since the beginning of the century, at least in terms of incidents at ADL or hate crimes that the FBI was looking at. So what happened? Well, first, 2013, you had all kinds of marches we saw in Europe. We had something that I really was struck by. In France, there was a march against the socialist government. And it was supposed to be put on by right-wingers, but extreme Islamists and left-wingers also joined. And they chanted a chant that sounded like what happened at the Dreyfus, after the Dreyfus trial, when Dreyfus was stripped of his epaulets and his military honors. they were singing or shouting all together, left, right, Islamists, Jews, France is not for you. Jews, France, and they were marching through Paris. Then in 2014, we had the Gaza riots in the wake of the Gaza war. And all through Western and Northern Europe, you had riots, attacks on Jewish synagogues, attacks on Jewish institutions, attacks on Jewish individuals, terrorist attacks, again, coming in Western and Northern Europe, primarily from folks who were citizens, but had, either were themselves or their parents or their grandparents had come from the Middle East. And this was very shocking to particularly the communities in France, in Belgium, and Netherlands, and Germany. Then I remember I was at a trip at the foreign ministry in Israel, and one of my colleagues who works on anti-Semitism at the Israeli foreign ministry was talking about this huge rise in 2015 of refugees coming from places like Libya, some cases from sub-Saharan Africa, but from Syria at that point, Afghanistan, etc. And when he began talking about it, I assumed that the Israelis would focus immediately on what that would mean for continued rise of Islamist type of anti-Semitism. And to my surprise, that's not what they talked about. They talked about this will cause a reaction from the nationalist and xenophobic right. And they were correct. It's exactly what happened. So even by 2015, however, levels of anti-Semitism, whether you measure it by incidence or you measured it by attitudes, were relatively stable and good. But that changed in the United States, starting about 2016 and 17. Our incidence of anti-Semitism has shot up. So where do we stand today in terms of anti-Semitism? What's its nature? What can we say about it? Well, we know a couple things. We know that economics, we have, especially with the pandemic and the new recession, as well as the 2010 and 9, tend to lead to higher levels of anti-Semitism. Not always, but there's a tendency. The rise of xenophobic nationalism, particularly in parts of Europe, Eastern and Southern Europe, often leads to this type of anti-Semitism. But frankly, not always. We have a situation in Russia. The Russian Jewish community today is probably as stable and as well off as it's ever been in Russian history. Whether that will continue, that's another question. We had the rise of what, on the left of what I would call the two-camp view of the world, where you either wore a black hat, where you were a colonialist, a Westerner, or you wear a white hat, which you're anti-colonialist, anti-globalist, anti-Israel, anti-United States. And this led to this increasing form of anti-Semitism. We know anti-Semitism tends to thrive on chaos, wherever it is. We know it tends to thrive more often than not in authoritarian countries and not in democracies, but this is not, again, a solid rule. We know that it's not rational, it's delusional anti-Semitism. And we know, maybe most importantly, it is not going to be addressed just by the Jewish community. There needs to be allies here if we're going to really address this issue. So when I gave speeches, particularly when things started getting bad 5, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2 years ago, I would always get the question, are we living through the 1930s again all over? And my answer is no. We can find analogies to the 30s, but there's some really strong differences. One, there are places for Jews to go, primarily the state of Israel, but it's also Western countries. Generally, many of them are open to Jews. Two, this is largely not, although there are important exceptions, this is not a government problem. This is a societal problem today. And in the 30s, it wasn't just Nazi Germany. There were numbers of European countries which you could clearly say the government was clearly anti-Semitic, and in many cases wanted to get rid of its Jews, if not by mass murder, by immigration. But if it's not the 1930s, what is it? Well, I think what we may be finding is diaspora communities under tremendous pressure. The smaller ones may just disappear. And having traveled all throughout the Jewish communities of the world, I will tell you some of these are quite, I would say, precious Jewish communities. They're in some cases 2,000, 2,500 years old. And you can't tell me that the destruction of a piece of society that's been around for that long would not be not just a tragedy for the Jews, but a tragedy for those countries. Certainly we have in this country, in the US government, at least when I served, that multicultural societies tend to be stronger than monocultures. Let me just make a caveat, however. We can't see very far over the horizon. I can't tell you what 10 years will bring. None of us can. Or as one of my friends who does a lot in the Jewish community, is one of the major pollsters in this country, says, prophecy for Judaism was dead over 2,000 years ago. We can't prophesize what's going to happen. We have an idea of what will happen in 2 or 3, 4, 5 years, but not much longer out than that. So again, I think we are going to have Jewish communities that are small, that are actually in danger, not threatened by mass murder, although there will be terrorist incidents in Europe, and I suspect in this country in coming years, but pushed out by rising levels of anti-Semitism and by attitudinal anti-Semitism. This is not inevitable. And some of the larger communities, France, Germany, the UK, that 5 years ago you wouldn't have thought of this, and yes, the United States are going to be maybe under some pressure. But we'll get into that a little bit more. So if that's kind of the nature of anti-Semitism, let me also talk a little bit about what is it like? And I'll tell you from my experience, again, at the State Department, I thought I knew something about anti-Semitism when I walked in there. But one of the things that struck me over the last 7 years of my working in this area is the complexity of the problem. This is a problem that morphs. Some people call it shape-shifting. It changes with time and place. Those are the two variables. Tell me the place you're in and the time you're in, and your anti-Semitism, either variable shifts. It may be very, very different. Let me give you an example. 5 years ago in the UK, you would have not said that left-wing anti-Semitism is the major problem in the United Kingdom. You probably would have said South Asian Muslim communities and levels of anti-Semitism in their communities was the bigger problem. That has not been the case over the last 2 or 3 years. The situation in the Labour Party was disastrous. It may be changing, but the levels of left-wing extreme anti-Semitism are very different. Another example is Argentina. Argentina has one of the larger Jewish communities in the world, about 250,000. And again, 7 years ago, even 5 years ago, well, 6 years ago, there were really no real problems. Then the president of Argentina, President Kirchner, she began tweeting directly anti-Semitic material, including calling her Jewish community traitorous, which raised red flags for all of us around the world, both in Jewish organizational world, but also in the US government. These things shift and shape shift in very quick times. So let me give you another example of the complexity that I'm talking about. One of the great, great human rights success stories, certainly in the 20th century, was the Soviet Jewry movement. And when it started in the early 60s and 70s with citizen volunteers, et cetera, few people thought that the superpower that was the Soviet Union would allow an ethnic minority out. They hadn't done it for 40 years or so. They were fairly adamant this was also a highly educated minority. Few people thought it could succeed. But miraculously, over 30 years, it did. But as difficult as that problem was, I think today's problems are much more complex. Why do I say that? Well, in the early 60s or 70s, when we were beginning that movement, you really had to go to one single address to deal with the problem. In my class, I always ask for hands at that point, what's the address? But since we're all muted, except for me, I'll answer my own question. It was the Kremlin. We literally had to just go to one red square. And if we could convince the Politburo it was in Soviet interest to let Jews out, it would happen. Today, we're not just dealing with one country. We're literally dealing with dozens of countries that have serious problems. And in any one of those given countries, I can't tell you that there's one address we can go to. In all those countries, there's multiple addresses we have to go to deal with the problems of anti-Semitism. Let me give you a further example. There's something in the European Union called the FRA, Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union. And FRA has done 2 surveys over the last decade of the Jewish communities in the EU and their own self-perception of the problem of anti-Semitism. And there's multiple questions that are asked of these EU Jewish communities, but the one I found most interesting was they asked people, have you thought of leaving your home country over the last 5 years because of anti-Semitism? Not because you want to immigrate to Israel for religious or ethnic purposes or because of economics, etc., because of anti-Semitism. EU-wide, in the first survey, 28% said yes. In Hungary, the number was 48%. In France, the number was 46%. By the way, today, the number in the European Union, at least as of a year ago, was almost 40%. So if you looked at those 2 numbers in the 2 countries, Hungary and France, you might think, oh, anti-Semitism is similar in both countries, and nothing could be further from the truth. In Hungary, like in Poland, you have the rise of really only one form of anti-Semitism: right-wing, nationalist, xenophobic anti-Semitism, the type that destroyed European Jewry in the 1940s. Now, it is not genocidal by any means, but that is the type of anti-Semitism, and it often manifests itself in an attempt to essentially distort history. I'm just dealing today, I wrote a piece because the Hungarians have been trying to build a second Holocaust museum in Budapest. Sounds good, but they want to build it and develop it with a woman who is a Holocaust distorter, and they want her to run it. Now, how ironic would that be? You build a Holocaust museum by someone who's a professional Holocaust distorter. And recently, the one museum that does exist and has been starved for funding by the government has been pressured to collaborate with 3 other research institutes in Hungary. They're all government controlled, and they're all are tainted with anti-Semitism. So again, you have a Holocaust institution that's being asked to change the real history. So that's Hungary. So in France, today, you have multiple forms of anti-Semitism. You have right-wing anti-Semitism. You have left-wing anti-Semitism of the global, anti-globalist, anti-Zionist type, although sometimes it has nothing to do with Israel. It is, when people talk about Rothschild and money on the left, this isn't just about Israel, although Israel is the main point. This goes much deeper. And you also have a extreme Islamist population. It is a very, very small percentage of Muslims in France are violent against Jews and others. But that violence in the period, particularly from 2014 to about till recently, was driving Jews to think about leaving France. Right-wing anti-Semitism and left-wing anti-Semitism were not violent, though that may be changing. French police in the last year have broken up a ring of right-wing nationalists that were planning violence against Jewish institutions. So again, this goes to very, very different types of anti-Semitism. And if you go to Germany, I would have told you 2 or 3 years ago, again, the major problem was Islamist elements, particularly in Berlin. But the rise of the alternative right party in the AfD in Germany is a serious, serious problem. And if you've been reading various newspapers, the German army has also been infiltrated by these neo-Nazi types and also police forces, etc. And the good news is the German government, the French government, the British government, unlike some other governments on the continent, understand the depth of the problem and understand that it's not just about their community. And let me give you, I could tell you cite statistics, etc. But let me tell you a story that I think illustrates what the problem is for many of these Western European Jewish communities better than any other list of polls or data, etc. So I mentioned earlier that in 2014, in July and August, we had the Gaza war. And the feedback from that war, the pushback in Europe, in Western Europe, and in Northern Europe, not in Eastern Europe, by the way, where again, we have xenophobic type of anti-Semitism, where demonstrations periodically led to attacks on individual Jews, attacks on synagogues, firebombing of Jewish businesses, an attempt to firebomb synagogues. Luckily, there were no deaths, but it was a very traumatic experience. And if you remember back in that period, there was a lot of talk about Jews leaving France, primarily going and making Aliyah to Israel, but also there was talk of Jews coming here, coming to Quebec, where at least they could be speaking their native language. And this was huge. And so I had the opportunity, again, I was at the State Department at the time, I had the opportunity to go to Paris, and our embassy set up a meeting with the leaders of the Jewish community, of the Jewish organizational world. And we met in the head of the embassy, it wasn't the ambassador, it was called, when the ambassador's not there, you have a chargé. Chargé has a beautiful house in Paris. She invited us all to her house for lunch. There was about a dozen of them and me. We had a nice lunch, although I must say, it was the only time I've had bad French wine. It was kosher French wine. I know there's good kosher French wine. I've had it many a time. This was horrible. Can't imagine that. Other than that, it was a wonderful lunch. But at the end, I got up and asked the question that was on everybody I knew's mind, and that is, what's going to happen to your community? Are you all going to leave? And a young man actually his name is Ron Azugi, very talented young man. And now a young man, he's probably in his late 40s, I'm guessing now. He got up and said, he was the head at the time of what's called SPCJ, which is the Jewish Volunteer Security Agency in France, which protects Jewish communities and works closely with law enforcement. And every European community has one of these. And I think we're probably moving to some kind of model like that in the United States as well. We have something called Secure Community Networks, which is not quite as extensive, but I think, again, we will get there. And as Ron stood up and said, everybody I know, literally everybody, is talking about leaving. But then he said, but even if it gets worse, most of us won't go. It's just too hard to leave your country, your family, your culture, your language, your profession. We may talk about it, but we won't do it. We said, but that's not the end of it. If it gets worse, or even if it stays at this level, we will have certain really serious problems. One, the community will start dying for lack of money. Who wants to give to a Jewish day school for a perceived dying community? And even worse, when we send our kids to school, if we send them to public school, they can be harassed and even physically beaten up. We send them to a Jewish day school, they're the target of Islamist terrorists. And 2 years before, as you probably remember, 3 little children, 2 of which were toddlers, were shot point blank in the head at a Jewish day school in Toulouse. He said, as a result, a third of our children today go to Catholic schools. It's the safest option for us. And then he said a really interesting thing. He said, the government has been great. And I actually can attest to some of that. I would call them during the riots in August and early September, and I would ask, to talk to one of the heads of the community who I'd met in previous trips. And invariably during that period of crisis, I would get things like the assistants would say, she can't speak to you today. She's in a meeting with the President Hollande. Or he can't speak to you because he's in with Prime Minister Valls or Interior Minister Cazeneuve. Literally, they were meeting constantly with the government. But then Ron said, but the government's not good enough. We need civil society to back us. And though we know the government will, we don't know that civil society will. That's the big question. And then he ended with what I thought was the most profound and interesting piece of this. He said, but ultimately, this is not about us. We may be the first to feel the pain, but we won't be the last. This is about the very values of the French Republic. And I think that's not just about the French Republic, it's about values of democracy and pluralism that are under attack when anti-Semitism raises its ugly head. And the United States, let me just say briefly, I am worried about what I would say, the breaking of taboos, the types of things that you did not say in public. You certainly didn't say in polite company about Jews just a few years ago. Increasingly, those taboos are being broken. And we know the violence, whether it's Poway or Jersey City or Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, the violence is historically large. What I will say, however, attitudes have not changed, as far as we can tell. If you look at, Pew does a very interesting poll every year, and for at least the last 4 or 5 years, it's had the same result. It asks about every religious group in the country, mainline Christians, Catholics, evangelicals, Muslims, Buddhists, etc. It asks, rate this group, ask every American, a sample of every American, rate this group on a thermometer from 0 to 10, 10 being the warmest feelings, 0 being the coldest feelings. So which group is rated highest? Which religious group is rated highest every year in the last 4 or 5 years? Jews. Now, the numbers are not hugely different than, say, usually Catholics are second highest rated, only a point or 2 higher, but that's been pretty consistent. So attitudes are not changing, interestingly, though when taboos about Jews break down, people begin talking about Jews being responsible for COVID-19, etc. I don't think attitudes can hold up forever. So that's what we face here today. I worry less in some ways about the American Jewish community, but as I said at the beginning, I can't tell you what's going to happen in 10 years. None of us can. So we've talked a little bit about types, but let me go over one of the things I talk to my students about. It's really useful to try to identify different types of anti-Semitism. But there's no kind of standard approved list of types. Sometimes you talk about, especially people who have an historical background, they talk about kind of religious or Christian anti-Semitism being replaced starting in the mid-19th century as you had growing democracies and you had the Enlightenment 100 years before and Jews becoming full citizens. People revolted against kind of medieval stereotypes. But then with Darwinism being the rage, you had racial anti-Semitism, where racial groups were kind of marked, graded by their inferiority or superiority. Jews were not stupid like non-whites or non-Anglo-Saxons were in many of these kind of systems. They were very cunning, very smart, but still subhuman. And then you have, in that type of categorization, you also have a third type, which we call anti-Zionist, or some people would call modern anti-Semitism. And we have certainly all three types. I like to go with a little simpler, which is left-wing anti-Semitism, right-wing anti-Semitism, and Islamist-based anti-Semitism. Again, it's extreme Islamist. Having said that, this doesn't explain everything. Doesn't explain the violence in Jersey City. These people could not be categorized in any of those categories. It doesn't explain the attacks on Haredi in Brooklyn, or like Williamsburg, Crown Heights, etc. It doesn't explain that as well. As I said, this is extremely complex. Let me just move for a minute to what can be done about it. If you go to various conferences on anti-Semitism, and I've gone to my share, the Israelis hold them every year, except in the COVID period, or every other year. The Russian Jewish Congress has held them, European Jewish Congress has held them. Jewish organizations, State Department's holding one next month on anti-Semitism on the internet. But if you go to these larger conferences, they always hit a couple of issues. The first is security. Jewish communities in Europe, particularly, but increasingly in the United States, need security. It's absolutely essential. Now, we have to be honest about security. It can't protect everybody all the time. No security can. But you can minimize risks and harden targets. The other thing you have to say about security is that absolutely essential as it is, it does nothing to defeat anti-Semitism. It's a mere essential, but a mere Band-Aid. The other things that people talk about are things like data collection. We don't know the levels of anti-Semitism until we have better data collection. And we, as well as most of the European countries, belong to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which mandates we keep hate crime data. The fact of the matter, most countries either don't keep it, actually majority don't keep it, and those that do keep poor data. And this is a real problem. And we talk about it for a decade now, we've done very little about it. The third piece everyone talks about is education. Education, everybody agrees, is essential. But to be honest with you, we don't always know what type of education is effective. Just teaching the Holocaust, particularly if you're teaching it as history, may or may not have any impact on anti-Semitism. I've heard story after story of European high schoolers, et cetera, being bored out of their mind, or in some cases being very antagonistic. For many of these kids, you might as well be talking about the Middle Ages. It has no impact on their lives. I have seen Holocaust education that does have major impacts on kids, but we don't have any systematic guides for that. And by the way, it probably changes from culture to culture. So we have to do more work there. Everybody, and this is not my area of expertise, actually, there's a lot of things that are not my area of expertise, but I, being someone who is now on Medicare, am not great on social media. I use some social media, but this is not my area. But there is no doubt that a piece of the rise of today's anti-Semitism has to do with our information networks, particularly social media networks. And to give you again an analogy, people will tell you, I've heard people say, that when the printing press was created, it took a century or two for people to know how to deal with some of the negative consequences of this mass production of written literature. We don't have a century, we don't have decades to deal with some of the problems we're having with social media. a social media environment, which, by the way, morphs and changes itself very, very quickly. This is something we have to deal with. One thing you don't hear a lot about, you're hearing some about, is civil society. I'm a big believer that one of the ways you deal with anti-Semitism, as well as other forms of discrimination, is at the local level. There's a great story that you can read about. Maybe some of you actually heard about it. And there's some more modern ones, but I like this one the best. In the mid-90s, in the Mountain West, you had the rise, and we've had a continued rise of extreme right-wing, sometimes Christian identity, sometimes pagan types of groups that are not only racist, but deeply anti-Semitic. In the mid-90s in Billings, Montana, these groups got very active. And one of the things they did, I think it was December of 1994, there was a young kid, Jewish kid, Billings. I've gone synagogue there, but there may be only 100, 200 families at most in Billings. And a young boy had a menorah in his window, and somebody threw a masonry block through the window and knocked not only just the window out, but obviously the menorah. This petrified the Jewish community, particularly his family. And the response was spontaneous. The local paper ran a full-page picture of a menorah. They asked people to cut the menorah out and put it in their windows. And there were menorah marches through Billings. And the message was to the haters, you don't belong in our community. We don't want you. You're not part of us. If we can catch you at something like this, we're going to put you in jail. But even if we don't, we will ostracize you. I can give you many other examples of this. You had churches, you had business leaders, you had groups like fraternal organizations like Masons or Eagles or whatever, coming together, sending that message out. And that leads us to this other question of, this is not something we deal with Jews alone. Jews alone can't solve this. And having been in the US government and being proud of our government for the last now 15 years of having an anti-Semitism kind of monitor and person to combat anti-Semitism worldwide, we're the first nation that did that. I'm proud of that, but frankly, the US government alone with the Jewish community can't solve this problem. It has to be just larger coalitions of church leaders, of civic leaders, of political elected officials from the president all the way down to city council members. This is the way you begin to root this stuff out. So let's end with the question that I get from my students almost every class. Why? My answer is I don't have a good answer. Talked about it, it's not rational, it's a delusional. Whatever form anti-Semitism takes is delusional. One of the great labels for anti-Semitism on the left was actually, the label was created over 100 years ago, and they called it the Socialism of Fools, because it supposedly used the socialism of anti-Semitism socialism to solve societal problems, which it obviously could not. But the best thing I've read about this, and it's kind of an academic text, I give it my college students, although it's a difficult text, is something by a professor at Chicago University, who wrote a book called Anti-Judaism, which is essentially a history of thinking about Judaism and how the process of thinking about Judaism through the centuries has been central to Western civilization. To use Judaism as a thing by different people at different times, people that often never even met a Jew, but could tell you what Jewishness was all about, and would put that label often on people that were clearly Christians, but they would say this is a Jewish trait, is a way that Western civilization has perpetuated itself. Now that's not very helpful for us in fighting this thing. And it's, again, I think the best explanation, but not far from being a perfect one. But I'm less interested in the why, and I'm more interested in the where and who. Because we can't fight this stuff unless we know what type of anti-Semitism it is and where exactly it's coming from. So one of the things I say to my students, but also everybody I talk to about this is not a problem for partisanship or ideology. If we're on the left or on the right, it may be comfortable to blame the other side. It's all over. It's on the left. It's on the right. It's in other communities. And unless we know the type it is and who is perpetrating it, we can't even begin to address the problem. Now, I am not a pessimist about all this. But I do want to also, I think I'm a realist both on that and another final point. When we talk about anti-Semitism and combating it, we're not talking about stopping anti-Semitism. Let's be clear about that. That's not going to happen. Not in my lifetime, not in your lifetime, not in our great, 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 great grandchildren's lifetimes. It's been around for centuries, for at least 2 millennia. And I think it's a good bet that it will be around for centuries to come. But that's not pessimistic. What we can do is something very important. I use the metaphor of a faucet. We can't turn the faucet off, but we can turn it down. It was turned down after World War II for many decades. We can do that again. And that in itself is absolutely essential. So from that, let's, we have some time for some questions, Bill?
Sure. If anybody has questions, you're welcome to unmute yourself, or you can put it in the chat and we can make sure that they're answered. I don't have anything in the chat to start with.
Well, it's always that in a Jewish audience, it's hard to start, but once it starts, there's an avalanche of questions.
So I'll start then. You mentioned the form of anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Could you define what is the line between being critical of Israel and being anti-Semitic?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't have a fine line. I don't have a definitive line. We do have a tool which began to be developed in the Bush administration in 2006 to 2008 or 9, and which was formally adopted by the State Department in 2010 under Obama, and which is being used by the Trump administration now. It's called the Working Definition of Anti-Semitism. Sometimes it's called the IRA, not me, Ira, but IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance Working Definition. And the definition itself is pretty unexciting. Talks about perceptions of Jews or non-Jews, but I don't think it's particularly helpful. But there are about a dozen examples that are associated with the definition, including at least half of them having to do with delegitimizing Israel, treating Israel with a double standard, or demonizing Israel. And those, and there are some other examples also of that talk about, but those are essentially the key parts of the definition. And what it does is, in much of the world, as you know, I'll give you an example. During the Gaza demonstrations of 2014, a synagogue in Wuppertal, Germany, was firebombed. It was done by 3 men who have Palestinian background, who admitted it, were caught and admitted it, and they were tried, but 2 judges, first the trial judge and then an appeals judge, said, oh, this is not anti-Semitism. This is merely anti-Israel activism. And they were given kind of non-jail sentences. Well, this is just unacceptable. You firebomb a synagogue, that's anti-Semitism. And we need to make that definition clear. That's the strong point of the working definition, and I think it should be used in that way. But it also leaves a lot of gray area. And, I think one of the things, as we deal with things like working definition, what's more important, and when I started that job again at the State Department, if you ask me what's anti-Semitism, I say, well, if somebody hates Jews and, what they think, I'm less interested these days, not totally disinterested, but much less interested in what people think and more interested about the effects of their actions or words. That's a better way to look at anti-Semitism. And there is not always bright lines. The working definition says that criticism of Israel, which is similar to criticism of other countries, is not anti-Semitic. It also gives all these examples, and it says these could be anti-Semitic depending on context. And that sounds like a cop-out, but it's really not. You really have to be smart about this, about when you use the term. And sometimes you can criticize people and go after people without calling them anti-Semites. Sometimes it's more useful to say this was an anti-Semitic act, whether not calling you necessarily an anti-Semite. I use it, anti-Semite. Sometimes I don't use the term when I think the act was, but I think I want to still talk to that person because I might have an impact. We might be able to do something about that person. Because if you call someone anti-Semite, end of conversation. It's like calling someone a racist. It is totally appropriate to do that in many cases. But sometimes you may just use your judgment. And if we overuse the term, it's like crying wolf. But there is no question that people need to know that when you just substitute the word Israel or Zionist or Zio for Jew, that doesn't take you off the hook for anti-Semitism at all. People need to know when you say something like, you can criticize Israel, criticism that I may not think is right or correct. But that's different than saying something like, what the Israelis do to the Palestinians is exactly what the Nazis did to the Jews. That tends to be anti-Semitic. And we need to call it out. So I would love to have a tool that's perfect. It's not. It's nuanced. But nuance sometimes is helpful. And in this case, I think it is. And we should be adopting it when State Department, in my tenure, not because of me, frankly, but although I supported that policy, we tried to get countries overseas, and we continue to do this in the Trump administration, to get countries overseas to adopt it. We never pushed it to be a domestic definition, but I think that we're coming to that. I would support that. Again, you have to be judicious in using it, but people need to understand. A lot of times people say, oh, you can't criticize Israel because you're just be called an anti-Semite. That's a cop-out too. Many of us who are Zionists and pro-Israel will criticize Israel periodically. That doesn't make us anti-Semitic.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's totally satisfying, but I think it's the best way to deal with it. Other questions? Thoughts?
Hi.
Sometimes we say, let's skip the questions and go right to corrections. I'm happy to take corrections as well.
Hi, I have a question. Can you hear me? Good.
Yes.
First of all, thank you. It was really interesting. My wonder is, you talked about the fact that a lot of the time anti-Semitism is irrational.
Yeah.
So how this is something that, like, me as an individual, or each one of us as an individual, when we face in anti-Semitism act or a person, how should we react? How should we handle it in a way that, like, to have the conversation with the other person and not just like push us away, if it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had perfect answers here. I've been in places where I've been in a cab and someone starts spouting anti-Semitism, and I have to decide, especially when I was younger, I did not want to take that on. Now, sometimes I will. If I think this person is irrational and there's no talking to them, I'm not going to I may just get out of the cab, but I'm not going to have a conversation. If I think there's a way to talk, and of course, you've heard a ton of stories of people who have been, like, for example, white nationalists who have been converted, some of whom worked for either ADL or Southern Poverty Law Center, fighting anti-Semitism and racism. That happens. And I think those, again, it's because people like yourselves, and not, again, one of the things I want to say, my students talk to me about this too. What can I do personally? Which I think is really some of it you're getting at. And I say, you don't have to be in government. You don't have to work for ADL or American Jewish Committee, though they do some really good work in these areas. And I'm not just saying that to be nice. I was very impressed with some of the work I saw in places like Europe by American Jewish Committee in particular. I've seen, some of the ADL work is excellent and other Jewish organizations. But, the Soviet Jewry movement was started by individuals, not by any Jewish organizations. And literally a group of scientists, NASA scientists in Cleveland, and students in New York, totally not paid, not professionals. They started with study groups to understand what was happening to what was called at the time the Jews of Silence. They learned about it. And the same thing about anti-Semitism. You don't have to be an expert, but you need to have some understanding and knowledge of what's going on. And they essentially built a grassroots movement. So yeah, I think you can do stuff yourself, sometimes one at a time. I don't have a perfect, this is the kind of the measure of how you do it. But I'm sure you've been in situations where you think, wait a second, this person seems like a reasonable person. Where is this coming from? I think that's the type of person you may want to spend energy to start working on.
Thank you.
Have you guys been having any problems with anti-Semitism in Reading? I have been, I try to track anti-Semitism through the English language press. I have not read of any vandalism or graffiti in your neck of the woods. I've seen some in Pennsylvania, but I've not read anything. Have you gotten anything in recent years? Bomb threats, those types of things? Bill, I can't hear you. You got to unmute yourself. Margot, you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, we haven't had bomb threats, but in the last 2 years, we had 2 or 3 incidences of swastikas on schools or other walls.
Targeting directly Jewish families or just kind of in general?
In general.
Yeah. Margot, you had something?
Yeah.
I was gonna say the same as Bill.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's all right. No, as I said, I keep something Bill mentioned at the beginning called, I did it for my students, but now we publish it at Moment Magazine. You go to momentmag.org. Moment's a magazine that Elie Wiesel started. And you can see it. It's a database that is by country, by date. It goes back to 2018. I started in 2017. And I have, the incidence of these types of things like swastikas, graffitis, it's not a good number exactly to say, like the ADL number of incidents. It's not, but I will tell you, in the United States, we've seen a dramatic increase just since 2018. I see it. I mean, I just have my list, but you can all go see it. What it is it'll give you a country, and then by date, it'll start giving you all these newspaper articles. Just click on a link, and you can see what it is. You'll go to the newspaper article. And 2 years ago, a lot more of it of the totals were coming out of Europe. Right now, a lot more is coming out of the United States, particularly last year in the United States and the UK. A little less in the UK this year because of Corbyn being defeated and a new leader of the Labour Party. And Adi, that may be a way, if you're interested, again, getting, that's one, there's lots of different resources. That's just one resource you may want to look at.
Already wrote it down. Thank you.
Anything else I can answer or say, no, I don't know the answer, which is what I say most often to my students. But that's just more of the real world. I hope they understand. A lot of times we just don't know.
What is your thoughts on free speech as it relates to anti-Semitism and hate speech?
Good question. Again, when I was in government, we were told, you don't attack the First Amendment. So we never advocated for having government censorship of speech, which is what the First Amendment is. It's if we would work with with friendly governments that were really trying to deal with anti-Semitism in places like France, particularly, but even lots of other countries on the continent, Germany, etc. The UK is somewhat in between. And they would, if you look at French plans for fighting anti-Semitism, a lot of it is about government censorship whether it's social media or other types of censorship. And they put people in jail. I mean, a lot of places in Europe, if you say Jews to the gas, you can go to jail. We never advocate for it. And frankly, I do believe in First Amendment. But on the internet, we have something different. It may not be the role for the government to say, you must do this, although Congress may pass some laws on this, and we'll see what the courts say about it. But whether it's Google or Microsoft or Facebook or Twitter, these companies all have what's called terms of service. We've all signed these terms of service. And it says, if you violate the terms, we can throw you off. And increasingly they are. And that's not government censorship. That is, people may not like it and say it is censorship, but it doesn't violate the First Amendment. So I will say, I think some of that is going to be important and useful, but it has its limits. The French go after, there's a French comedian called Dieudonné. And Dieudonné is, I think he was born in West Africa. He's a right-winger. He is not an Islamist. He is not from the left wing. He's a right-winger. And he is deeply anti-Semitic. Dieudonné has had numerous court filings against him. They shut down his shows, his comedy shows, because a lot of it is anti-Semitic. And there is a backlash. People saying in France, even though they don't have First Amendment, of the Jews are just the kind of like the government does everything for the Jews. And so it's not a full answer. But I think we have to figure out ways. Again, we talked about that social media, we don't know how to deal with it. And we don't know how to push back. We have to learn how to push back on different social media platforms. That is one way of taking some of this stuff down through terms of service. So I hope that addresses it. And I think that does it without violating First Amendment's free speech rights.
Thank you. We had a question come in through the chat. Do you think that Trump has caused an increase in anti-Semitism?
Well, let me be truth in advertising. I worked for the Obama administration. I helped Obama in his campaign. I'm a Democrat. But I also said to you earlier, it is not useful for us to politicize this. We're going to deal with anti-Semitism. It's an issue where we need Democrats and we need Republicans to fight this. So I am loath, even though I'm not in government anymore, I'm loath to, since I am a Democrat, to criticize Trump. I think Trump, the Trump phenomena, which is not just Trump, we saw an increase of anti-Semitism in 2016. This is not unusual. Often in elections, you saw it, for example, there was a huge jump in anti-Semitism in Hungary in 2010 when a new ruling party came to power. And it came in with the elections. And in 2016, we saw that jump. I wouldn't blame it all on Trump. I would not, I don't like call, I wouldn't call Trump an anti-Semite. I don't think, A, it's useful. B, I don't know what's in his head. C, we all know he has Jewish family. He's been pro-Israel. That doesn't all, none of that necessarily means you don't do anti-Semitic things. I think he has misspoken sometimes, but there are people on the left who misspeak all the time. So I think the phenomena of what we see with anti-Semitism is related to some of these other things. Again, it's not just Trump. I think the president sometimes doesn't help the situation, but we have problems with speech and people saying things and taboos being broken, which has begun in the Trump era. But I don't think it's fair to say it's exactly coming from Trump. And I think the president can take some criticism. I much prefer the criticism comes from his friends and conservatives and Republicans. It's my job, people like me, to do it with Democrats. Because we had plenty of stuff on the left as well on the right. And another thing I'll say is, I often see people talking about, well, it's really not from the right, it's mainly from the left, or vice versa. People on the left say, well, it's really the only people with power doing it on the right. When Farrakhan says that he has no power, so it's not anti-Semitic, that's garbage. I don't think it's really useful. It's useful to be brutally honest with ourselves when we see anti-Semitism and understand exactly where it's coming from, even if it comes from people that ideologically we feel more comfortable with. It needs to be called out specifically. I don't think it's particularly useful for us to get, especially in the United States when we have tons of anti-Semitism from different places. It's not useful for us to get in arguments, oh, it's worse on one side or another. Just call it out and be honest about where it's coming from in any given circumstances. And if we do that, we will be calling out plenty of stuff on the right and we'll be calling plenty of stuff on the left.
Thank you. Were there other questions that anyone had?
Well, thank you very much tonight. I certainly enjoyed, it was much better than talking to my dogs tonight. And I got much better reaction from everybody. I saw some smiles, I saw some frowns, but that's great. Wish you guys all the best. Chag Sameach. Hope you have a chance to have a meal in the sukkah. Or if you're really into it, sleep one night in the sukkah. I've done it myself. It's a little cold even down in Washington sometimes, but it can be fun especially when you have kids.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.